Good evening and welcome to Armor of God Apologetics, where we aim to provide the believer with the full armor of God so that he or she may defend the faith against the wiles of the devil. Just as a recap of our last video on the cosmological argument for God's existence, we went into some detail about the Kalam cosmological argument. Basically, this argument states that everything that came into existence has a cause. The universe came into existence as evidenced by science. Therefore, the universe had a cause. It's essentially the same thing as looking at a building and saying that the building exists, it came into existence, and it had to have had a builder in order to come into existence. Naturalism is hard-pressed to explain the existence of the universe, as it simply does not follow from our scientific observations that matter pops into existence from non-matter. In other words, something doesn't come into existence from nothing. Now let's move on to what is known as the teleological argument for God's existence. This argument gets its name from the Greek word telos, which means purpose or goal. In contemporary apologetics, this is also known as the argument from design. Now, in reality, in my mind, this actually encompasses several different lines of argumentation for the existence of a designer, namely God. We will cover the first one today, as it is the beginning of the refutation of atheistic and naturalistic neo-Darwinism. You see, the basics of the beginning of neo-Darwinian evolution is the concept of abiogenesis. For those of you who don't know, abiogenesis is the concept that the original life, the simplest of life forms, actually came from non-living molecules. In other words, in the primordial soup of the early formation of the earth, molecules came together that were not living and ultimately resulted in a living entity. This living entity then went on to evolve into what is now all life forms. Now, obviously, this is a somewhat simplistic view of it, but the bottom line is that abiogenesis is the concept that life came from non-life. Now, before we get into the problems with this concept, let's talk just a little bit about science and philosophy. First of all, as I told you in previous videos, I'm a scientist. I was a chemistry major in college, and now I'm a physician. So by definition, I come from a very strong scientific background. Science is based on the ability to observe phenomenon and predict, based on past observations, what is going to happen in the future. In other words, science relies upon repeatability. In fact, it's one of the arguments that atheists use against miracles. One of the most famous skeptics, David Hume, basically said that he could not believe in miracles because it was always more probable that common and repeatable events are more likely the explanation for an observed event. In other words, because we don't observe miracles on a regular basis, they are never going to be the most probable explanation for an observed event. Now, I'm not going to get into any of the flaws of David Hume's argument, of which there are many. Rather, using his argument to demonstrate that the fact that the skeptic pointed out that in most cases repeatable events are much more likely than non-repeated events. Why do I bring this up? Well, you see, in the millennia or perhaps millions of years since the inception of life on this planet, none of us has ever observed the spontaneous eruption of life from non-life. Therefore, it is ironic that scientists are the ones who argue that we should believe that life popped into existence unguided due to random molecular processes. So let's look at what it actually means for a cell to be a living thing. To do that, let's take a look at the mycoplasma bacteria. Many would argue that the mycoplasma, which is one of the smallest bacteria, is also the simplest life form on Earth. Others might claim that things like viruses are life forms. However, I would contend that because they rely upon a host in order to replicate, they truly would not really be considered, in my mind at least, a true living independent life form. Therefore, let's look at the mycoplasma for just a moment. So what does it mean to be a mycoplasma cell? In other words, what makes up a mycoplasma bacteria? First, although it does not have a cell wall, it does have a three-layered lipoprotein cell membrane. Additionally, within the cytoplasm of the cell, there is not only soluble proteins, but also RNA, as well as the 70S ribosome and the cell's DNA. Let's consider the simplest portion of that cell, which is the soluble protein in the cytoplasm. Here's where many naturalistic atheists turn to what is known as the Miller-Urey experiment. This is an experiment which was performed in a laboratory in the 1950s. In the experiment, these two scientists took what they thought was a bubbling mixture of what the original milieu of the primitive soup, as well as a gaseous environment that they surmised was what made up the environment of the early Earth. They ran electricity through it, and lo and behold, they produced some very simple amino acids. This is sometimes used to show that, quote, life can be made from non-life. But let's look at what was wrong with that experiment. First of all, it has since been shown that the gaseous environment they used as representing the Earth's early atmosphere was most likely inaccurate. Second of all, these two scientists used a very high concentration of the elements that they surmised made up the primordial soup. It is highly unlikely that the early Earth's environment was made up of such high concentrations. Third, it is an extraordinarily big stretch to say that amino acids are even anywhere close to proteins. You see, if you know anything about protein synthesis, you know that amino acids have to be folded in a very precise manner in order to ultimately make up a protein, especially one that is functional. So to claim that making a few simple amino acids is anywhere close to making proteins is simply false. Furthermore, let's not forget perhaps the most important thing about all of this, and that is that the experiment was done in a controlled environment by people with minds. In other words, it was done by intelligent design, not by random chance. Many have sought to repeat Miller and Urey experiment. However, none of them are any closer to producing life in the laboratory than Miller and Urey were. This is despite all the advances in technology and equipment, as well as some 60 plus years of origin of life science research. Now, let's move on to the cell membrane. Although mycoplasma does not have a cell wall, it still has a 3-layer thick cell membrane. In the past, it was thought that the cell membrane was simply that, a membrane. You might think of it kind of like putting saran wrap on an uneaten portion of a baked potato. However, more recent advances in science have shown that in fact the cell membrane and cell wall are extraordinarily important in cell signaling and thus are not simply passive containers for the remainder of the cell. Even if they were, however, lipoproteins that make up the cell membrane of mycoplasma and other bacteria are in themselves extraordinarily complex molecules. Again, it then becomes the burden of proof of the atheistic naturalist to explain how these extremely complex molecules came to be organized in a cell membrane. Quite frankly, this simply is not plausible. And in fact, calculations have been done that indicate that there simply was not enough time, even in an old universe model, for these type of molecular interactions to have taken place. Now let's move on to the real nail in the coffin for the atheistic naturalists and their argument for abiogenesis, and that is DNA. First, I would like you to think about the function of DNA. What does DNA actually do? Well, DNA contains all of the information needed for every single living entity, no matter how small or large, to carry out the processes that make up the organism. For the mycoplasma, it gives all of the information on replication, the building of other proteins, and any other cellular functions. For humans, it's presumably at the top of the evolutionary chain, according to the neo-Darwinists. DNA contains every bit of information that is needed for one sperm and one egg ultimately to result in the formation of myriads of different body parts with different functions that make up a human being. Here's where origin of life scientists have a very hard time, however. DNA is an extraordinarily complex molecule. Its molecular structure is much more complex than the average person thinks. Furthermore, this is the real problem. DNA does not make itself. It doesn't replicate itself. Rather, RNA and ribosomes are needed for replication. The kicker is in order to get RNA, you have to have DNA. Additionally, you have to have ribosomes in order to get RNA or DNA. But you also need DNA to get RNA and ribosomes. So you see, the problem is here. DNA is reliant upon our ribosomes and RNA. RNA is reliant upon DNA and ribosomes are reliant on DNA sequencing. So the origin of life scientists and atheistic naturalists really are left with a quandary. Which one is the chicken and which one's the egg? How could you have gotten DNA and had it replicated if there was no ribosomes? While at the same time, how do you get ribosomes when it requires DNA for their production? Finally, how can you replicate DNA using RNA, which is what we know from modern science? DNA is reliant upon both ribosomes and ribosomes reliant upon DNA. The bottom line is this is an irreducibly complex system. If you don't have one, you don't have the other. Thus, the entire naturalistic explanation for abiogenesis simply does not hold. This is key to understand. But I don't want you to just take my word for it. Please do click on the video, which is linked below, of famous nanoscientist Dr. Tour, who does an eloquent and quite humorous explanation in detail about the lack of evidence for origin of life science. In fact, his conclusion is that origin of life sciences are actually no closer to producing life from non-life than they were when Miller and Urey did their original famous experiment. In fact, they might actually be further from a true understanding of how life came into being from non-life. The Christian, of course, doesn't have this problem. Genesis 1 teaches that God created everything in the universe, from the universe itself to all living creatures. And this is not a God of the gaps argument, as many atheists have argued. Living cells have an immense amount of specificity, irreducible complexity, and information. In no other realm would a rational person argue that these things came into being unguided out of nothing. Therefore, it is completely irrational and, in fact, illogical to conclude that life came from non-life. Rather, it is rational to believe that there was a life giver. Again, thank you for watching, and I encourage you to click on the links below about the origin of life science by Dr. Tour. I hope we've whetted your appetite for further discussion of the teleological argument. On the next video, we'll be covering more detail about the molecule that gives information to all of life forms, DNA. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, give us a like and be sure to subscribe to Armor of God Apologetics. Hit the bell so you can be informed of any new uploads that we have on this channel. Thank you, and God bless.